the KGB was even curious about this gentleman. It may look innocent. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, a great spiritual leader, or maybe a great charlatan and crook, depending on from which side you are looking at him. Beatles were trained at his ashram in Hardwar in India how to meditate. Mia Farrow and other useful idiots from Hollywood visited his school, and they returned back to United States absolutely zonked out of their minds with marijuana, hashish, and crazy ideas of meditation. To meditate, in other words, to isolate oneself from the current social and political issues of your own country, to get into your own bubble, to forget about troubles of the world. Obviously, KGB was very fascinated with such a beautiful school, such a brainwashing center for stupid Americans. I was dispatched by the KGB to check what kind of VIP Americans attend this school.
That's you on the left.
Yes, I'm on the left. I was trying to get enrolled in that school. Unfortunately, the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi asked too much. He wanted $500 American for enrollment. But my function was not actually to get enrolled in the school. My function was to discover what kind of people from United States attend this school. And we discovered that, yes, there are some influential members of family, public opinion makers of United States, who come back with the crazy stories about Indian philosophy. Indians themselves look upon them as idiots, useful idiots. To say nothing about KGB, who looked at them as extremely naive, misguided people. Obviously, a VIP, say a wife of a congressman, or a prominent Hollywood personality, after being trained in that school, is much more instrumental in the hands of manipulators of public opinion and KGB than a normal person who understands, who looks through this type of fake religious training.
Why would they be more susceptible to manipulation?
I just mentioned that because, you see, a person who is too much involved in introspective meditation. You see, if you carefully look what Maharishi Mahesh Yogi is teaching to Americans, is that most of the problems, most of the burning issues of today can be solved simply by meditating. Don't rock the boat. Don't get involved. Just sit down, look at your navel and meditate. And the things, due to some strange logic, due to cosmic vibration, will settle down by themselves. This is exactly what the KGB and Marxist-Leninist propaganda want from Americans, to distract their opinion, attention, and mental energy from real issues of United States into a non-issues, into a non-world, non-existent harmony. Obviously, it's more beneficial for the Soviet aggressors to have a bunch of duped Americans than Americans who are self-conscious, healthy, physically fit, and alert to the reality. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi obviously is not on the payroll of the KGB. But whether he knows it or not, he contributes greatly to demoralization of American society. And he's not the only one. There are hundreds of those gurus who come to your country to capitalize on naivete and stupidity of Americans. It's a fashion. It's a fashion to meditate. It's a fashion not to be involved. So obviously, you can see that if KGB were that curious, if they paid my trip to Hardwar, if they assigned me to that strange job, obviously they were very much fascinated. They were convinced that that type of brainwashing is very efficient.
This transition from the streets to the institutions was partially accelerated by public outcry in the late 60s. Members of the public were increasingly fed up with the proclivity of left-wing organizations promoting violent behavior that was the outward manifestation of their true ideology. An exemplary case of this insanity was documented by an undercover activist. In 1969, Larry Grathwohl joined the Weather Underground, a far-left organization, as an undercover agent for law enforcement. He would later reveal, after rising through the ranks, that he was given the task of taking directives and documents from the Communist International Central Committee and transferring them to various cities in which cells of the Weather Underground were operating. He believed that the International was exerting control into the Americas through Cuba. It is worth noting that legal assistance to these radical groups was often provided by members of the National Lawyers Guild, which was well known at the time to be associated with the Soviet Union as an ideological outpost in America. These lawyers supported several violent groups, including the Weather Underground, the Panthers, and the Puerto Rican FALN, a terrorist organization.
However, I can tell you that while I was with the Weathermen, we had certain people that were recruited out of universities, that were not allowed to attend meetings, that were dealt with on an individual basis by the person that recruited them. And the idea was for this person's record to be absolutely clean so that he or she could work themselves into key positions of authority and responsibility, and therefore be able to do a lot of damage at the right time. Obviously, it would be best if they were in the government somewhere, but or in public utilities. But really, it was sort of like you go on and make your career as best you can, and when the time comes, we'll let you know. So this person could be a vice president or a president of a corporation, multinational or otherwise. Primarily, it was to keep them out of the limelight and keep their records clean. Law enforcement was an area they'd like some of them to get into.
One group from within the Lawyers National Guild, Rabinowitz, Boudin and Standard, was particularly pro-revolutionary. Leonard Boudin, the head, was the father of Weather Underground leader Cathy Boudin, whilst Victor Rabinowitz was shown to be a member of the Communist Party. Their law firm was an official agent of Cuba in US courts at the time. During this period, the United States, under domestic pressure, also pulled out of Vietnam, handing that region over to the Communists. This is another noteworthy moment, as highlighted by Thomas Sowell. The media portrayed the US position in the war as one of continuous defeat and retreat, yet in actuality the US won every major battle in the Vietnam War. In fact, Communist forces admitted after the war ended that the surprise Tet Offensive in 1968, which was widely reported in Western media, was a shocking defeat militarily. The Viet Cong were almost annihilated during the offensive, and responsibility was now on the North Vietnamese army. Yet, in the ideological sense, the Communists were victorious. In America, thanks to Walter Cronkite, the media reported that the American forces were being massacred and that the situation in Vietnam was unwinnable. This had a huge impact on American morale. The Vietnamese communists would later admit that they often cared more about what was happening on the streets of New York rather than on the battlefield, for they knew that the war would be won or lost based on the sentiment of the American population.
In June of 1971, Daniel Ellsberg and Anthony Russo of the RAND Corporation were charged with espionage and theft of government property when they delivered for publication certain highly classified documents, which became known as the Pentagon Papers. The publishing of these documents provided the Soviets with an effective anti-American propaganda weapon in Southeast Asia, and also gave them the key to our secret diplomatic code, a key they could use to decipher hundreds of older messages recorded and stored for just such a breakthrough. Ellsberg and Russo claimed that freedom of the press gave them the right to obtain and publish these documents. A team of National Lawyers Guild attorneys was assembled for their defense, and the head of this team was Leonard Boudin of the law firm Rabinowitz, Boudin and Standard, a registered agent of Cuba.
In 1974, following the Watergate scandal, a new campaign was taken up against the House Committee for Un-American Activities, which had now been renamed.
But even at the height of the Watergate backlash, the pro-abolition forces were easily defeated when the issue came to a vote. In 1974, the final vote was only 86 in favor of abolition, with 247 against. But the following January, a change in the procedures of the House of Representatives placed into the hands of the Democratic caucus the power to appoint committee chairmen and to establish House voting rules. The man elected as chairman of the Democratic caucus that year was Congressman Philip Burton, the same man who 15 years earlier had helped to lead the disruption of the House committee hearings in San Francisco. Burton wasted no time in using the power of his new position. With the help of Congressman Robert Drinan, a Catholic priest from Massachusetts, and with other longtime foes of the committee, he drafted a measure to abolish it. This was not in the form of proposed legislation that, as in the past, could be openly debated, but as one of the new operating rules of the House. As such, it could not be singled out. All the rules had to be accepted or rejected as a single package. A no vote would have paralyzed Congress until a new package could be rewritten. Many congressmen who favored the continuance of the committee were unwilling to delay the opening of Congress, and others were equally unwilling to vote against their own party caucus. And so on January 14, 1975, the House Committee on Internal Security ceased to exist. After the vote, Congressman Drinan was recognized on the floor of the House and introduced into the congressional record a tribute to Communist Party member Frank Wilkinson for his efforts on behalf of the successful abolition campaign.
Thus, congressional investigative committees were essentially abolished. The only one remaining was the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, which was under the Senate Judiciary Committee. Shortly after, in March 1977, this subcommittee was abolished following a successful campaign by Senator Ted Kennedy to cut all funding. This marked the end of such committees in America. In 1975, Barry Goldsmith admitted that there had been significant communist infiltration within Congress.
I was told when I was flying to the funeral of Chiang Kai-shek with Vice President Rockefeller that his committee had learned of instances where the offices of senators had been infiltrated by Soviet agents or Soviets or some sort. I said, "Are you going to publish that?" He said he would, but it was never published. I asked him once why it wasn't. He said, "I was requested not to publish it."
It is still not known who gave orders to the Vice President to conceal this information, but it is clear that there were such orders from above. That same year, the Justice Department itself would come under the control of Edward Levi, a member of the American Lawyers Guild, who redirected much of the department's attention from actual concerns to opposing groups who were advocating for better internal security. Levi, backed by both the Lawyers Guild and ACLU, enacted a new restriction on the FBI. They could only investigate an individual or organization if proof already existed that they were planning a criminal act. Shortly after, this rule became even more absurd. The FBI could only conduct investigations if the crime was to be committed within the next 48 hours. This was certainly deliberate, as it was well known that most successful FBI raids, counterintelligence, and counter-terrorist operations were the result of months of investigation and observation. Through such restrictions, the FBI were effectively hamstrung. In fact, from 1973 to 1979, the number of internal security threats being tracked by the FBI dropped from 21,000 to just 147. The number of FBI agents in counterintelligence and internal security also dropped to a mere 143. For context, during this same period, it was estimated that roughly 2,000 KGB agents were operating in the US alone. Throughout the 1970s, Philip G., a former CIA agent, had been publishing the names and addresses of CIA agents abroad who were anti-communist. Many of these agents were targeted for assassination, and one was killed. One of the agents responsible for this was Czech Soviet agent Vladislav Dittman, who later defected.
The two disinformation departments, again under the supervision of the Soviets, decided to start a long-term operation against the CIA, making life as hard as possible for CIA. That is to label many American diplomats, politicians, cultural representatives abroad as CIA agents and paralyze their positions. Specifically in 1966, the first major operation was to prepare a book which is called Who is Who in CIA. Shortly after coming to the United States, I found this book in many bookstores. I have it at home. And for example, it was quoted by the Covert Action Bulletin, or
is this AG's group, the group?
Yes, that's right. It's one of the major sources of information about CIA man. That's, of course, that's ironic, because that is a communist disinformation.
Over 900 of the most experienced security personnel in the CIA would later be fired by Stansfield Turner, who was appointed head by President Carter. Thus, the agency was further reduced in efficiency, experience, and morale. It was now at the whims of those who had for so long been slowly climbing through the ranks. This likely played a part in the increasing criticism of right-wing or nationalist movements in South America, which had previously had the support of the CIA in order to prevent communist organizations from seizing power. Morton Halprin was another standout figure in the late 1970s. He was head of an anti-security organization paradoxically called the Center for National Security Studies, who helped Leonard Boudin provide legal assistance for Philip Agee. Yet previous to this, he had been on the National Security Council as senior assistant to Henry Kissinger. He personally prepared the famous Pentagon Papers, which were secretly released to the press, which further dismantled any legitimacy that the US should be taking part in anti-communist operations.
The notion that there is a Marxist-Leninist conspiracy in the world, in light of the very, very substantial differences between various countries who call themselves Marxist-Leninists, is absurd. I think the only people left who take Marxist-Leninism seriously are American right-wingers who have a need for seeing a conspiracy opposed to them. And I think
during our interview, Mr. Halprin remained soft-spoken and composed while discussing questions of civil liberties and constitutional rights. But when we asked him about the Communist Party connections of his associate Leonard Boudin, this was his reply.
That's absolute nonsense, and you know that's absolute nonsense. Mr. Boudin can speak for himself about his past affiliations, but I think that's, first of all, totally irrelevant to the question of the defense of Daniel Ellsberg, and also absolute nonsense. I think the Communist Party is, like the Republican Party, a political party. I think there may have been people in it, as there may have been people in other political groups, who took orders for foreign powers and who may have violated some laws of the United States. And if they did, the government has a right to investigate them.
Anyone can become a Republican or Democrat. Could anyone join the Communist Party?
I did not understand the function of this interview was to discuss the Communist Party, and I don't think I have anything useful to say on this subject.
Now these people come up and they advocate something, but they don't advocate it as a communist. They advocate it as a distinguished professor or a former foreign service officer or somebody who served in the National Security Council, and they're taken at face value with what they're saying. And they are succeeding in making a wrong presentation of the state of the world today. And I say give them all the liberty in the world, but identify them so that when they do talk, we know who they are and that it's the voice of Moscow speaking and not the voice of our American academe.
By the late 70s, with almost all opposition wiped out in the security apparatus, attention was turned towards the FBI. As noted previously, the FBI had managed to retain a relatively good record in contrast to other security centers, and the Justice Department under Edward Levi was hot on their case. The FBI had been at the forefront of investigating potential internal threats and presenting this evidence to the public. Thus, from a communist perspective, it was necessary to subvert and destroy. Leading the charge was none other than the National Lawyers Guild, backed by the ACLU. In 1978, under pressure, the Justice Department indicted Mark Felt, a top member of the FBI, and his assistant Edward Miller in charge of domestic intelligence. They were accused of such things as entering into the houses of members of the Weather Underground. What was conveniently left out was that these entries were used to gain information on terrorists who had been responsible for and planned to continue bombings and other terrorist attacks across the country.
In March of 1970, a luxury townhouse in Greenwich Village, New York, blew up with a tremendous explosion. And as an interesting sidelight, out of the smoking and dust and rubble ran two females. One was completely naked, and the other had a pair of jeans. That was the Kathy Wilkinson and Catherine Boudin. They went to neighbors and got clothes and eventually were spirited out of the country to Cuba. But the interesting thing, and most people don't know this and they should, what they were doing there was making bombs. They were making anti-personnel bombs. They were taking 4 or 5 sticks of dynamite, hundreds of heavy nails, and taping the nails on the outside of the dynamite so that when it exploded, it would send those nails out in every direction, and of course, any one like a bullet. So they would have killed hundreds of people had they been successful. I was very concerned, and at that time, I authorized FBI agents to enter the apartments of 5 members and supporters of the Weather Underground, trying to search for information that would tell us where the next bomb was going off, or what their plans were, or where the fugitives were, intelligence information. This is a technique called surreptitious entry. Some people call it a black bag job, which had been accepted in the FBI in important national security cases for as long as I was in the Bureau.
Surreptitious entry is forbidden by law when used to gather evidence to convict a person for a crime already committed. But when used for the purpose of preventing a crime from being committed, especially in the field of espionage, it is an accepted practice in every civilized country in the world.
In the espionage field, the worst thing you could do would be to get a warrant, because a warrant has to be served. And if you aren't in your apartment when we come to serve a warrant, we have to leave a copy of it attached to your front door. So if you're a Russian spy, what does that tell you? That tells you they're on my tail. I better stop what I'm doing. I better pull back. From the counter-espionage standpoint, you can't let the enemy know what you're doing or how much you know. So
it's very interesting to note that in the trial of William Miller and Mark Felt, who were 2 senior officials of the FBI, harassed in the courts under the Carter administration for their efforts to stop terrorism, a stipulated document was entered into the court record which said that Leonard Boudin had been a secret member of the Communist Party USA. Now, I think this is important, Mr. Griffin, that it was a stipulated document, and that in legal terms, I understand, is one that was agreed by both the attorneys for the defense and for the prosecution.
It was clear that the FBI was under attack for one reason only. They remained one of the few organizations capable of stopping ideological incursions into the state. This exact point was ironically made by one of the biggest critics and a prosecutor of the FBI, Federal Judge William Bryant, when he asked the court jury before they retired to ignore everything except one point. Did or did not the FBI enter into the houses of communists? In 1980, Felt and Miller were found guilty of violating the constitutional rights of Americans, which cost them over $1 million. This was paid for by FBI agents and friends who saw through the veneer. Nevertheless, since this time, the FBI has steadily been demoralized. It had been forced to destroy over 80% of its documents pertaining to internal security threats. In one example, documents and surveillance monitoring of the Puerto Rican terrorist group FALN was stopped. And soon after, this same organization blew up a tavern in a terrorist attack, followed by 4 other bombs in Manhattan.
I happen to know that the Civil Rights Division was recommending the indictment of from 50 to 60 FBI agents in New York as a result of this investigation. Well, that was, at that time, was when I felt I had to do something. So I came forward and made a public statement and said that I had authorized those, that if anyone was responsible, I was responsible. Ed Miller, who was another Bureau official, came forward a few days later and said pretty much the same thing. And it was as a result of that Miller and I were indicted for violation of the civil rights of these individuals.
On April 20, 1978, Mark Felt and Edward Miller arrived at federal court in Washington, D.C. for their arraignment. 1,200 FBI agents and former agents awaited their arrival at the steps of the courthouse to demonstrate support. It was clear that more was at stake than the future of two men. The FBI itself was on trial by its enemies. When we asked Mr. Halprin about the role played by the National Lawyers Guild, again he became upset by the question.
I think when you attempt by asking questions about was the campaign for political rights started by the Lawyers Guild, which will then be followed by a question of did I know that the Lawyers Guild was named by the California Un-American Activities Committee as a communist front, that the only conceivable purpose of such questions is to attempt to smear organizations and to discredit their work by tenuous and illegitimate connections which are absolutely irrelevant to what they're doing and can serve no other purpose than pure McCarthyism.
With the gates now open, radical leftist organizations could now operate with a higher level of sophistication. In one telling case, in 1979, a number of leftist radicals sued the police for monitoring them. Representing them was attorney Jonathan Moore from the National Lawyers Guild, and his three partners who were all open members of the Weather Underground terrorist organization. The judge ordered the police to hand over all documents on their monitoring of the FALN group. These documents included analysis of FALN bombing patterns, predictions on future targets, and methods for police to counter the organization. It even included informants and undercover agents. All of this was directly handed over in the court to members of the FALN. They now had open access to all of the police intelligence and could counter anticipated police tactics. Copies of these documents were later discovered in a Milwaukee hideout for the FALN.
In Los Angeles in 1982, involving a case in which the police were being sued by the ACLU, acting in the name of the Coalition Against Police Abuse, the attorneys demanded a complete list of all ranking ex-officers now employed in the nuclear power industry, a blueprint of all organizational units within the police department showing the detailed function of each, and a list of names of all the officers in each of these units. The intended use of this information can only be imagined.
If the Weather Underground organization had been allowed to run amok in 1969 and 1970, I don't know how many people might have been killed. But because of my activities and other people's activities, the weathermen had to spend a lot of time trying to determine who the informants were, who the police agents were, and this distracted them from their goals. And I have no doubt that there's a good number of people alive in this country today because of what myself and other people did.
At the same time came another new set of concepts, broadly referred to as postmodern theory. Claiming to be an anti-ideology, postmodern theory was established primarily by former Marxists. Although denying any connection to revolutionary ideas, many of the postmodern theorists promoted what could be described as a revised and nuanced form of critical consciousness, that is, the critique of Western society and the formulation of alternatives. While postmodern theory itself would impact Europe more than America, its offshoots would play a profound role in the emergence of radical leftism in the 1990s. As with Adorno and Marcuse's critical theory, the postmodern theories were often oriented around a profound sense of nihilism. One of the key elements of postmodern theory, after all, was the rejection of grand binding narratives and ideas such as religion, and claiming that all truths are subjective, momentary ideas promoted by the ruling class. Today, postmodern theory is most often associated with names such as Michel Foucault. However, socialist intellectuals Jean-Paul Sartre and his partner Simone de Beauvoir were influential in setting the stage for later postmodern concepts. A rather telling moment came in 1977, when many postmodern thinkers, most notably Foucault, Sartre, Beauvoir, Gilles Deleuze, and Jean-François Lyotard, to name the most prominent, signed petitions advocating for the removal of France's age of consent laws, claiming that they were discriminatory. They also advocated for the release of anyone imprisoned because of violating these laws, including an individual who had violated a 6-year-old girl. The major development from these concepts was known as intersectionality. Emerging as a byproduct of both critical theory and postmodern theory, intersectionality attempted to merge social criticism with power dynamics. The concept was to categorize individuals based on perceived oppression or villainy. A woman could be categorized as being part of a victimized group in contrast to a man, and if the man is African American and the woman white, another contrasting dimension is realized. The man may be an oppressor being in the male category, yet oppressed being in the marginalized category of African American. The woman also is a victim in the category of women, but an oppressor as part of the category of white. People can be at the intersection of many categories of sexuality, culture, economic status, and the list goes on. Intersectionality would quickly become one of the most influential ideologies on American college campuses. The goal was for the stratification of society and the organization of one or more angered and disenfranchised revolutionary classes. Despite the gross, oversimplified categories and black and white thinking, intersectional theory would rapidly grow in popularity from the 1990s onward, reaching a peak in recent years. From the multitude of neo-Marxist thinkers, the most influential in terms of the real-world outcome of their ideas would be Marcuse, Adorno, and Horkheimer, with their modernization of Marxism into critical theory, Antonio Gramsci, Paulo Freire, and György Lukács also for their theories on education and institutional control, and finally Jean-Paul Sartre and Michel Foucault for advancing postmodern critiques on power and structure. Bezmenov provided us with a summary of what he called the demoralization process, or active measures. This 4-stage process visualized how neo-Marxist ideas would take hold and eventually destroy a society, in this case, America. The demoralization process matches up with the theories of Lukács and his contemporaries, and as Bezmenov noted, it would take many decades for its slow but steady effects to be felt. Those effects would be to destroy the old in order to establish the new. These nihilistic theories reach out to those who are prone to emotional manipulation, form victim groups and mentalities, isolating and nurturing a revolutionary class. The end, of course, being the same state of chaos produced by the vulgar Marxists of old. The blatant nihilism and pessimism expressed through such ideologies as critical theory are as dangerous as a leaking nuclear reactor. The balkanization of the West is well underway, and as Bezmenov warned, most people remain unaware that they are in a state of ideological war, and the radiation is slowly killing them. To defeat this cultural cancer, we need to educate ourselves to identify the threats and then to counter them.
You've been watching part 3 of How Communism Took Over America. Please subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for more of our history documentaries.